Welcome to this presentation on the role of insight in addiction and recovery. Last week we looked at the role of spiritual factors in addiction and recovery, which involves a range of psychological processes, including identity and constructing a narrative. And we saw that that narrative could be centered on the 12 steps approach and other forms of cognitive restructuring. In this presentation, we will explore this in more depth, but not from a 12-step perspective, which involves accepting the ideas of chronicity, comprehensiveness, and acceptance of disease. Broadly speaking, there is a division between insight and action approaches to treating addiction, as we can see from this slide. So we can see some of the insight approaches here: psychodynamic therapy, person-centered therapy, Gestalt therapy. We haven't explored all of these. We did look at Freud in some depth. And then we have the action group of therapies, and we've looked at this ideas associated with Skinner, Watson, and Bandura, and also cognitive therapy. This time we're going to look at an approach which doesn't feature directly on this list, but explores the use of insight more generally. I'm going to be drawing on a paper by Philip Harland called A Deconstructivist Approach to Understanding and Working with Addiction. The first point to note is that he uses this word deconstructing or deconstructivist. And the first steps in this approach are, first of all, understanding addiction. We have to deconstruct what we mean by addiction or dependency. What is it, how it happens, and how to understand it. And then second of all, we develop a model of addiction, breaking down the addictive processes so that you know where you are and can work out how you or anyone else got there. So the first thing that Philip Harland does is ask you to consider your own experiences of attachment or compulsion. A time when you were enthralled to some attitude or activity that you found difficult to control, even if it was against your will or better judgment. So he asks what kind of psychological processes are operating here, and I put in brackets both positive and negative. He does focus entirely on the negative side of this equation. So he talks about things like shame, guilt, vulnerability, and importantly, he also mentions the idea of extinction of choice that characterizes the later stages of addiction. And again, we've seen this idea of extinction of choice as being an important aspect of addiction. However, throughout this module, we've looked at other aspects of the psychological processes associated with addiction. We've looked at the idea of choice. We've also looked at ideas of learning, sensation seeking, peer approval, and more generally as an escape from negative emotions. But there are also positive aspects of drug use, perhaps not addiction, but we've also looked at ideas of creativity, spirituality, and achievement. So that's the first point that Harland does, is to get you thinking about how does one end up engaging in different forms of addictive behavior. Harland then looks at addiction in terms of this continuum here, and he conceptualizes 5 stages, going from starting with a bad feeling or negative emotions, doing X, the addictive behavior, to make you feel better. This then becomes a desire for the addictive behavior, and then a need for the addictive behavior. And then finally, when the addictive behavior is in possession of you, when your feelings of choice are greatly reduced or completely obliterated. So do these stages always apply? Is it necessary to have this stage 1? Perhaps not. Perhaps there are some forms of addictive behavior that just arise as a result of wanting to feel better in some ways. To some extent, I think these stages are a bit like Pavlov's model of classical conditioning, whereby doing something, doing X, removes the aversive behavior, and the conditioned stimulus becomes very, very strong. And so we can relate this to some extent to the stages of change model that we looked at earlier. There isn't a direct correspondence between this model and this model, but we can see, for example, how these processes might relate to the relapse. For Harland, then, deconstruction is a very important part of understanding addiction, and he calls this approach clean language. Clean language prompts an inner dialogue with the client's unconscious mental processes, so it has some similarities to psychoanalysis and cognitive behavioral therapy that we've talked about already. If we model the addiction rather than the individual, we end up classifying people as gamblers or drug addicts. And in his view, no one addict is like any other. So this process of deconstructing then supposes the possibility of reconstructing as well. So how could you use this continuum that we just looked at? Here are some examples. To affirm for yourself and the client that addictive states don't just come from nowhere, but are something we construct from our own experiences. Secondly, to track where your client is in relation to the addictive behavior. And thirdly, to track back with them to likely points for intervention. Harland regards metaphors as very important in understanding addiction. Recent research into everyday conversation shows that we use metaphors very frequently. Metaphors so fundamental to the way we think and speak that only the most obvious ones register in our awareness. For example, I'm forever running up against a brick wall. I'm carrying the world on my shoulders. I think I'm cracking up. I see a light at the end of the tunnel. We intuitively know that everyday things and behaviours such as walls, running, the world, lights and tunnels, so on, are being used to represent other experiences such as a lack of progress, excessive responsibility, an unwanted state of mind, or finding hope. Metaphors evoke rich images of what is being described. They can vividly express a single idea or a lifetime of experiences. When we talk about our problems, our emotions, our desires, we are even more likely to make use of metaphors to convey the depth of our experiences. One of the most prominent examples of metaphor in English literature is the All the World's a Stage monologue from Shakespeare's play As You Like It, where he says, all the world's a stage and all the men and women are merely players. So we can see how important metaphor is for understanding our behaviours and feelings. Take anger, for example, and think of times that you've been angry and how would you describe that experiences. You might say that you reach boiling point and then blow your top, or you have a ferocious temper and try to fight back your rage, or unburden your anger by getting it off your chest. In the first example, anger is symbolized as a hot fluid, so your natural response might be to cool things down or let off steam. In the second example, anger is represented as an opponent or a wild animal, so you may want to defeat it or keep it under control. In the third example, anger is regarded as a burden to be removed, therefore you might want to stop it building up or holding it in for so long. The actions we take will be consistent with the metaphors we use. Harland gives examples of various exercises that you can do to explore metaphors, and all of these basically involve asking questions. So, for example, identify a metaphor for when you're angry and act inappropriately. And ask yourself, when I'm angry and act inappropriately, that's like what? So you're being invited to supply a metaphor here. Draw the metaphor that comes to mind. Look at the drawing and ask yourself the following questions so you get to know more about the symbols in the metaphor. So for each part of the drawing, ask what kind of something is that? Is there anything else about that? So it's basically asking a series of open questions about the metaphor. So the purpose of the exercise is to enable you to have more choice in how you respond to situations where in the past you feel you have acted inappropriately. Harland suggests 9 basic clean language questions that we can see in this slide. The aim of these questions early in the process is to allow information to emerge into the client's awareness by exploring their views on the metaphor. So questions 1 to 2 request information about the metaphor. 3 to 4 ask for locational information. 5 to 6 reference the past. 7 to 8 represent the future. And 9, which is the odd one out, offers a client the opportunity to make a lateral shift in their thinking about the metaphor, and so really just an open question to explore it in a bit more detail. Another useful term that Harland uses is the mirror model. The mirror model deconstructs experience and reflects it in such a way that it is reconstructed. So it's a model of conversational change to help somebody stuck in their present way of thinking and shift their attention and learning into thinking about the context, the past, the future, and metaphorical frames of reference. So the mirror model is another way of looking at the clean language questions that we looked at earlier. Here we can see the different frames of the mirror model: the present, the past, the future, the context, the higher aspects of the addictive behavior, and the metaphorical aspects. And you can see each one of them comes with a set of questions that you can use to explore the different dimensions of the addictive behavior. Here we see a summary of the 6 frames of reference that we've already looked at: the present, the context, the past, the future, and we'll just look at the higher aspect here. So the higher frames of references asks, are there higher considerations that might help them with dealing with it? In other words, at what stage are they at in terms of wanting to change their addictive behavior? Is it important to them that they change their behavior? So it's about looking beyond the actual behavior itself in terms of the meaning that the addictive behavior has, and whether that can be used to explore ways of changing their behaviors. So in some aspects, it's similar to the stages of change model that we talked about earlier. Harland also talks about this in terms of different levels and suggests asking a number of questions. Here we have the first 2 questions concerning the primary level, which involves the self interacting with the environment. He stresses that you don't have to plough through every question, but every question is a reflective intervention in its own right. Responses to different kinds of question will have its own re-educative effect on the client. And bear in mind that any question could be the key. The questionnaire is designed to help addictive clients account for and get to know and trust their own responses. It's a participatory audit that takes the client into the different frames of references. Therapists and clients model their responses in such a way that deconstruction and change are inevitable. So here we see an example of the first 2 questions. What has been the general context of your addictive behavior? And as well as this general question, we have some follow-up questions. In what surroundings did it manifest itself? For example, social situations, relationships, etc. What were the influences outside of you in terms of society, family, peer pressure? So these are all open-ended questions that will encourage reflective thinking. Here we see some more questions that Harland suggests asking. I won't go through them all. There are many questions and you can read through them all at this website. We'll just look at question 8. Which of your skills, capabilities, and strategies will enable your addictive behavior to change? This is an appeal to client creativity. So having identified their skills and capabilities, how can any of these cross over into the change territories? So as I said, the questions explore different levels that all encourage reflective thinking. So going back now to metaphor, Harland quotes David Grove, who says, "Metaphor mediates the interface between the conscious and the unconscious mind." Here we see some of the first statements, for example, in relation to smoking, chocolate, all these different metaphors that are being used. And these symbolic expressions of the client's relationship with their addictions all have the potential for helping to generate change by going through the process that we just looked at. So here we can see the process advocated by Tomasello. And what he says about it is, you will eventually be able to intervene in this sequence of body-mind interactions, but meanwhile the client, who step by step can describe their addictive behaviours, is already taking significant steps towards sorting themselves out. In other words, the mirror model that we've just been talking about. In some cases it could be that simple, though in many cases we need to go further. And an important part is this idea here of taking responsibility for the behaviour. And when, as for example Tomasello does, talks about psychological approaches to addiction, we might want to think about, is this an important concept to be thinking about? Harland also goes on to say, however, the jaws of paradox grip many addicts, so it's not just a straightforward process. The dilemma of being caught between the polarities of aversion and attraction is the most typically addictive bind and is the one most resistant to deconstruction. So it's not an easy process to disentangle. He gives the example of somebody who's a computer expert and overworks. And he says at one point, he says, I can't stop working. But at another point, he says, I must stop working. So what he's actually saying is, I can't stop working, and at the same time, I must stop working. So this is what we might call a double bind situation. And this is where we can begin to think about what are the options for dealing with this situation. Harland further expands his ideas in part 3 of this document. He notes that the client's complete account of their addiction is unlikely to be available instantly. Some parts may never have been accessed or expressed before. And this quote's interesting, I think. This quote says that self-reflective questioning can effectively assist somebody to completely reorganize their cognitive conceptual structure, with the ripple effect influencing deeper organizing metaphors, embodying experience, and neurochemical processes. So whether there's any evidence for this or not, but it's interesting to think that reflecting on addictive ideas can result in changing cognition and also perhaps changing neurochemical processes. Harland then goes on to identify 20 separate but intimately related incremental changes for a client's body-mind system to make before the true changes can take effect. So here we see the stages going from 1 to 9, so gradually exploring the nature of the addiction. And while superficially this might seem similar to the 12 steps that we looked at previously, arguably these are fundamentally different. There are no articles of faith underlying this system, and there are no underlying principles like accepting that it's a disease or that it's a lifelong condition. I think this is a much more neutral account of understanding addiction. And here we see steps 10 to 20. Harland quotes Richard Bandler, who said that therapy is 95% information gathering and 5% change work. I think that's an interesting observation, that we need to collect and interpret as much information as possible before thinking about making change. Knowledge itself, in Harland's view, becomes the catalyst for change. As new information or the recognition of existing information changes, this will feed back into the client and the system will reorganize. And I think these later steps are really reminiscent of the stages of change model that we discussed earlier. So now we'll just use a case study to look at some of these principles. So Sam says he wants to change his eating habits and lose 20 pounds. When we look more closely at this desire, it develops into that he wants to control my compulsive eating. So clarify, what does he mean? What kind of control are we talking about? What does he mean by compulsive? So Harland talks about taking him through the addiction audit that we've looked at, a comprehensive analysis of the attitudes around and influences on the client's addiction. And this is an important part without making any assumptions. And Harland says, we'll just see if any patterns emerge during the audit that Sam may recognise and elect to find out more about later. So the case study goes on. First, we look at emotional gain. Sam describes his compulsive eating as like filling a garbage can, a fascinating metaphor, but it doesn't sound like there's much gain from this. We check cultural influences. Sam speaks with feeling about the layout of his local supermarket, where sweets are concentrated near the checkout, a place that he has no choice but to linger at while queuing. He also talks about family influences, including an exciting ritual when his father, absent for most of the week, would produce a special treat after lunch. And the case study goes on. I'll just quote some of the detail. Harland says, we then go back to school where Sam had to have special remedial lessons for his dyslexia. He would eat a whole packet of biscuits as a way of distracting himself at emotionally difficult times. They also break down the sensory distinctions relating to his enjoyments of chocolate. I wanted the sensation of sweetness, like the crumbling texture. I enjoyed the feeling of melting in the mouth. You can sense yourself how addictive an indulgence this could become. We look at Sam's strategies for his compulsive eating and discover an association with rest. When he's working, he doesn't notice the need for chocolate, but when he stops, he does. We find that when he's with friends, he's considerate and eats moderately, but when he's alone, there's no inhibition. Somewhere in this information generated by this audit is a clue to the solution that Sam wants, which is to rid himself of this compulsion. But where is the clue? Early in the audit, Sam finds himself going back to school. He has a bad feeling. What is this bad feeling, I ask? He pulls a face and he says, oh, I don't want to go down that route. I hesitate. I don't want to lead him, but my experience tells me that this may be a good route down which to go. And without prompting, he adds, yes, I guess we should. So you can see how Harland gradually uncovers the different parts of the story, gathering information, as we talked about, to understand this patient's addiction. So Harland now summarises what has been learned and what the next step should be. He says we consider the issues at all levels of Sam's experience: environment, behaviour, capabilities, where he talks about that he can't control it, his beliefs and values, but I believe I can make it disappear, identity, and the sort of person who would have to forget I ever liked chocolate, and considerations beyond the self. It would be better for human progress if I were healthier. So Harland notes, somewhere in this information generated by this audit is a clue to the solution that Sam wants, which is to rid himself of the compulsion. But where is the clue? And as we saw earlier, one possible place that the clue lies is in Sam's childhood. It may not be, but it's worth exploring. So I think, as we can see from this approach, It's not linked to any one psychological theory, but it does contain elements of many of the different approaches that we've looked at: psychoanalytic views, cognitive behavioral therapy, and so on. I think the key from this approach is that it's gaining knowledge which leads to insight on the patient's part, and perhaps this is what sets it apart from some of the other approaches like Alcoholics Anonymous that we've looked at so far. So at the start of this session we talked about the distinction between therapies based on insight and therapies based on action. And the one that we've been looking at today, the clean language approach developed by Harland, I think falls into the insight group. And it has some similarities with these other approaches that we've touched on, particularly psychodynamic therapy of Freud. However, I think the important point about Harland's method is that it's non-theoretical and it provides a relatively straightforward methodology of gaining insight. So what conclusions can we draw from the insight versus action debate? Roz Johnson, who writes at this website, states, "The differing theories are useful for understanding people and behaviour and promoting change. However, each theorist seems to contradict one another." She quotes two authors, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who wrote, "A moment's insight is sometimes worth a life experience." On the other hand, Milton Erickson wrote, "Change will lead to insight far more than insight will lead to change." Kotler and Shepard, considering the issue, write, "The movement towards evidence-based approaches has insight-oriented counsellors concerned because action-oriented approaches have received strong empirical support." So we've seen before approaches like cognitive behavioural therapy and so on have some empirical support. And perhaps this is because insight therapies by their nature are harder to evaluate. Going back to Roz Johnson, she says, "Interestingly, there's often a natural mix of insight and action no matter what the professed therapy orientation. Solution-focused therapy often becomes insight-orientated, and insight-oriented therapy generally also involves some solution focusing." The bottom line, she says, is it's best to go with whatever a client wants, and whatever a client wants is often what works. This is issued here as a statement, but perhaps it's best considered a hypothesis which will continue to be evaluated over the coming years.